And we're live. Hey folks, welcome back to the Dev Twitch stream. And my name is Nick Taylor. Hey folks, welcome back to the Dev Twitch stream. And I had to mute the stream. Sorry. I discovered I cannot do the chat in the streaming software because I'm not the dev account, I'm my own account. So, yeah. And yes, we can see Vaidehi, it's all good. So let me restart there with my false start. I managed to always work something with it. So welcome to the Dev Twitch stream. My name is Nick Taylor. I'm a senior software engineer at Forem. Forem is the software that powers Dev. I'm also here with my awesome co-host, as always, Christina Gorton. You want to say a couple words about yourself, Christina, before we introduce our guest?
Sure. I'm Christina Gorton. I'm the open source community manager at Forem. I do lots of other things on the side, but my day-to-day job is now with the wonderful Forem team with Vaidehi and Nick and lots of others. So.
Speaking of Vaidehi, Vaidehi Joshi is our guest today and is one of my other awesome coworkers. I feel like most people probably know who you are, Vaidehi, but just in case they don't, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and whatever you want to say, basically?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Vaidehi, as Nick mentioned. I'm a senior software engineer at Forem. I've been at Forem for almost 10 months, getting really close to a year. What else is there to know about me? I do a lot of like technical side projects in my free time, which it seems like I have less and less free time these days to do things. What people might know me from, if anything, is a project I did called Basecs, which was a year-long writing series that was exploring the fundamentals of computer science. And there's also a podcast with the same name, the Basecs podcast, that went on for 9 seasons. That was basically taking the same technical computer science concepts and distilling those concepts in audio format. And there's also videos. I've done a lot of different types of technical writing projects because I really love learning new things and helping, teach them to other people and bring them along on my learning journey. So usually if you like learning interesting things but want to find something that's like friendly and approachable, I probably have a resource for that concept.
Yeah, I gotta say,
I've used it.
Yeah, no, I didn't know you before I started working with you, but I really like your teaching style. I'm gonna fanboy a bit, but like just the way you articulate the concepts, it's just like I find it like anybody could pick it up, whereas and I think you probably talk about this in some of your podcast episodes, but like computer science books can just be intimidating and they don't have to be, and I think it's just really great the work you've done in that space.
Yeah. I remember just listening to some of the podcasts in the car with my husband and just being like, I understand now. We definitely love the work too.
Yeah.
That's so great. I love hearing people just like say that they're binging them. Like they'll tell me they're binging them on like long car rides or road trips, and I'm like, wow. I guess it must be interesting enough that you want to listen to them back to back. Because otherwise, like I think a lot of the time, it depending on who presents it, it can feel really dry. So it's always like a huge compliment when people are like, "Oh no, it was actually fun."
Yeah. I think I can listen to you and Saran just do like pretty much anything, so that's okay.
Yeah, like I think if you literally read the back of a shampoo bottle to me, I'd be like, man, that is really interesting. It's just because I know I don't have a radio voice.
Yeah. I think that segues into a good first question here. We do have an AMA that we had that we put on Dev, which I can share in the chat. Also, if you're in here and you have questions and you want to put them in the chat, I'll be checking that out too. So feel free to put some questions in the chat as well. This is the article that we had on Dev. And kind of the first question here, what was the first time you realized you loved teaching? They said your BaseCS series is excellent, and they just wanted to know, like, when did you realize you liked teaching? If you love teaching, we just assume.
I do love teaching. I actually, before I got into software, I was teaching abroad as a sixth grade teacher for a while. And so that was probably like the first time that I was like, oh, this is actually really fun. It's also really hard, and it's different to teach children compared to adults. And the kind of teaching I do now is like, I'm not sitting in a classroom with like 35 kids anymore. I'm like creating content and it's going out into the world, and you don't know who's consuming it and whether it's effective or not until you get feedback. So it's a different kind of classroom, so to speak. But I did actually do, I think the first 6 months after my coding bootcamp, I taught like an intro to programming course using Ruby. And it was with an organization called Girl Develop It. So this was like, I don't know, 6 years ago. And I just remember like explaining these concepts and watching the light bulb moment go off for a lot of people when they were like, oh, I can manipulate a hash like this, or oh, look, I can make this loop and make it be more efficient to print out the things I want. And it was just really rewarding to watch that happen. So I've always really loved helping people get to that point and like just bearing witness to that. But then I also really just love learning new things. So part of the reason that I love teaching is because I go through those own light bulb moments myself when I'm learning something new. And so I want to make it easier for other people to have that moment, especially with certain concepts that are kind of technical and sometimes can be presented very directly. It's hard to get that moment, and you can sort of just feel like you're struggling and like, oh, why can't anybody just explain this to me on a very rudimentary level? So sort of breaking those things down into their purest form, and then putting it out into the world so that people can be like, oh, that's what that is. It's not a big scary thing, or oh, it's just this little thing that people have like manipulated to look like this other thing. I'm talking in really abstract forms because I don't actually know what I'm referring to. That's what I feel like.
I've taught, so I get it. Like I've taught, so I get it. I think that's kind of one of the things is like, so kind of going on that some more. I've done like the classroom teaching. I've done like the through Zoom teaching classrooms, and then I've done like courses, right, where you're not you don't get any kind of feedback. Do you have like a preference that you like as far as like when you're teaching? Do you prefer like creating something, putting it out there, and then maybe getting feedback, or do you like that interaction that you get with people when you're teaching?
I like the in-person interaction better, just because it's different when you put something out and then you sort of forget about it, and then you may not even get the feedback for who knows how long. And I'll get feedback on things and comments on posts, or like people will tweet out things about certain episodes we recorded, and I'm like, oh yeah, that was 3 years ago. I've like forgotten what was my intention I put behind that. But when it's in a classroom or when it's like mentoring someone else on the team, I'm like, okay, I know what you're thinking and I know what I want you to get to, and like helping them get there is super rewarding. And it's really fun to like pair with somebody or to give a conference talk in a room full of people where at the end someone comes to you and says, oh, I never understood how this worked, and now you showed me this whole different perspective. Like that's really rewarding for me. It's harder to do, I think, with content creation, but that's why I try to find other ways to present the material.
Yeah, I think feedback can be hard because, like, one, you get feedback and it's a great thing because you can iterate on it. And then there's also the other side of feedback just being difficult to take. So it's like an upside of both, I think. Like when I'm teaching, I'm like, yeah, I like that, like the in-person. And then after a while, I'm like, I just want to do content because it depends on the feedback. But I think those are good answers. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Nick?
I was just going to say, I love the light bulb moments because, when you're struggling on something, you're like, man, I don't get it. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, and then it's like, how did I not get this before? And then it's like, it's in your brain forever after that. So it's really satisfying as somebody when you're learning something, when you have those moments, it's a generally like, man, I feel good now, So it's great that you've been able to do that for so many folks.
Yeah, and I personally just love when it happens to me too.
Yeah.
And it still happens like all the time. Like I will, be working on something and be like, wait a second. 2 years ago, I was doing this thing, and that's what this is. And oh my God, it's been there the whole time. It's just like I feel like I've been reborn. Like I've just said something a whole different. I love that so much. It's so fun.
Yeah.
Well, I think that goes on with this next question. Well, then, because this next question from Praveen was, "Hi Vaidehi. Currently, I am doing your BaseCS series, so another BaseCS love here. Thank you. How do you approach when stuck on a problem and not going anywhere? I'm working on a JavaScript-based project, but hitting some blocks and not going anywhere. Do you have any suggestions for like when you're learning something?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest thing that I've sort of learned is being able to walk away from something and just, not bang my head against the problem, and sort of take a break from it. A lot of the times, I sort of think like brains are like, you have to let them marinate a little bit. And a lot of the times, our brains are thinking about something and solving a problem in the background. And you sort of need to detach from a problem to think about it differently. And so a lot of the times, like you'll hear developers talk about how, oh, this thing that was really hard and it seemed insurmountable on Friday, on Monday morning, I like just approached it with a fresh set of eyes and, oh, I like, here's this method that did the thing that I wanted. And now I solved it in like half an hour. And I think there's something to be said to that, which is just like the fact that you should be able to, step back and maybe just reevaluate, like, okay, maybe I should step back and like reassess my assumptions, or maybe the thing I'm trying to do, I'm actually trying to make it harder on myself, and do I actually even need to do this thing? And a lot of the times that kind of like space really can help. And then, it just gives you this time to sort of marinate on the problem in the background, which maybe is like not very concrete advice, because it's, the problem that you might be facing could be different each time. But I've never regretted taking a step away from a problem and coming back to it later.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I got,
100%.
Go ahead, Nick.
No,
Okay.
just...
Yeah. When I got, it's okay.
No, you go. We're freestyling here.
When I was getting into development, I took the Learning How to Learn course that's on Coursera. And that's like one of the things they talk about a lot, is that our brains, the way they're working, or how they think the brain works right now, how, we're always learning about the brain, is that we have this time where we're really studying something, we're really getting in there, and then we have to make those connections. And to be able to make those connections, you have to take a break from whatever you're learning. So if you're like on a problem and you're going, you're probably not going to get those connections you need in your brain to like get it all. So if you step back and you just like, okay, and they talk about a lot of like famous people who would like purposely like take naps after they were like working on something and wake themselves up after a certain time so that they could like make those connections in their brain. So I think that's great advice, Vaidehi.
I feel like that's something Da Vinci did. Didn't he have like a sleep a half hour or something? I remember seeing some Seinfeld episode. For anybody that's seen Seinfeld, they talk about that. But yeah,
My son just watched it.
A lot of writers do that too, where they'll like work in the morning and like have these long uninterrupted spurts of focus time, and then like inevitably your brain can only do so much, and so you sort of go take a walk, or go take a nap, or whatever it is. And I think there is something to be said for that. Probably all of us could be just taking more naps and walks and just like taking a break from our screens, because it is very exhausting. Like a lot of the work we do is very intense and focused, and you really have to think through something. And if you lose your train of thought, you're like, oh my God, what was I working through again? And it's like you really have to like hold on to your thought as you trace code or read code or try to think through a problem. And that's just like really draining work.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And it's something you learn over time as it develops. Well, I think it applies to anything in life in terms of learning things, but you learn to know when to take a step back, because I know early on in my career, and I think it's part of the stigma of you need to be sitting at your desk for like 8 hours a day doing your job, or you're not working. Like this is like old school mentality, but I think that's what kind of dissuaded people from maybe doing that like early on. But like nowadays, like I do it all the time. Hey, yeah, take a 15-minute nap, grab a shower, or like, uh, it's I'm getting nowhere. You know what? I'm doing something else instead now. And like you said, the next morning you wake up and like 2 minutes you're like boom, 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 and it's all done. And it's like, I mean, not all the time, but like it definitely it 100% helps. It's like your brain resetting or something. I don't know what it is, but it's pretty wild. It's yeah. I'm seeing myself replay in the past on this Twitch stream, so it's a little weird.
I'm muted. There we go. No, good.
You were excited. You were excited though. You were like,
I was like, take breaks. Yeah. I muted myself and I turned off my camera because my son walked in here and wanted to give me a hug and talk to me for a couple of minutes, so I had to kick him out.
all good, all good, all good.
He always does this. Okay, so I think actually, I saw on Twitter recently someone, I think it was Angie Jones on Twitter. She said, when a senior developer is someone who takes the time to like just stop, like they know, like they don't know everything, but they can figure it out. And so I think that kind of goes into this question. Vaidehi, do you have thoughts on like what point did you feel like you could use the title senior software developer? Yeah.
This is a really good question. I sometimes am just like, I don't know exactly what that means because I have, like, especially in our industry, like I know there are people who have 2 years of experience who are like senior software engineer. And then I know people who have like 9 years of experience and they're just like, I'm a software engineer. And it's like, I don't even know how do you exactly quantify it in terms of like when you should start using the term from like an experience standpoint. But I will say that I think I started believing that I was not just a mid-level engineer anymore when I was fairly autonomous and also like starting to take the lead on a lot of technical scoping work. But now I think probably the thing that I look for when I'm like, oh, is this person really senior and experienced, is whether they can sort of evaluate why we're doing something and if we should be doing it, and like thinking of something long term. And so that is like a really abstract skill, because a senior engineer, or like, again, I don't even know whether that's the right term, but like somebody who has that kind of experience can imagine what it's like for that software to exist before it's been built, and think about whether it actually solves the problems that we're looking for, whether it creates more problems, and what it looks like when it's been like scaled to a certain level. So it's like, okay, what is the maintainability cost of the software? What is it going to look like from a financial standpoint? What is it going to look like from a support standpoint? And it's like the software doesn't exist yet, right? And so there's a sort of a difference between somebody who's a bit more junior and early, who's just like, okay, how do I get it to work? And then somebody who's a bit more mid-level, who's like, okay, I don't just need to get it to work. I need to like think about optimizing it and think about like whether it reads well, think about whether it can change easily. And then someone who's more experienced who's like, hang on, let's not write a single piece of code yet. Let's ask some bigger questions. And I think that's like the best way I can encompass like what that kind of experience is, because usually at that point that person has gone through the process of, okay, make it work, make it right, make it fast. Like they've done all that and they've seen that there's a limit to that too. And it's like, okay, it's sort of like taking a step back and being like, it's not just about make it work, make it right, make it fast. It's like, do we make it? And do we make it like this? Or if we make it, what will happen here and there in this part of the system? And those are harder things to quantify. And it's really hard to teach or even put your finger on. Like you just have to see a lot of things go well and then also go wrong. And that's when you sort of start to like learn, oh, okay, so in that product we did this and this is what happened. In this product we did that and that didn't go well. And so you sort of start to like pause before you take any action first.
Yeah,
I think that's great.
Yeah, I can even think of some concrete examples, like or a general, just not concrete, but a general thing, like, hey, we got to do this feature. We should first question, like, do we really need this feature? Is this really trying to solve the problem that we're trying to do? Like you were saying before you even jump into the code, because sometimes you can get out of these conversations where like, we don't need that, or it's really just this. And I think another thing too, which does come with experience, it doesn't matter if you're called senior or intermediate, but like not grasping the whole picture. So like you're saying, like as a junior person, to be like, okay, there's this bug, I gotta fix it, but like, why is that bug happening? Is it because something in the entire system is causing it, or because like are you just putting a band-aid on it? There's like, exactly.
It's sort of like, sorry, I think there's a little lag. I was just going to add one thing, which is, Nick, what you just said made me think of like a metaphor for it, which is that like, earlier career developers sort of just like putting band-aids over the holes in the ship and not necessarily like thinking about how they connect. And then somebody who's a bit more experienced is like, oh, maybe we need to replace the whole like floor of the ship. That's actually the problem. And then, somebody who's more experienced is like, okay, what are the bigger issues? Like, what are the symptoms of this sinking ship? I don't know. Maybe sinking ship is like really dramatic.
No, but
all software doesn't have to be a sinking ship.
Works when you're a junior, you feel like you're not even staying afloat, right? So you're just like, let me band-aid everything. So I think that works.
There's like some other story too about. I know there's a question there. Sorry, but there's this kid sticking his finger in a dam, like their thumbs, like, and there's like hole. They just keep trying to fill all the holes, and it's like they can't do it obviously because, well, one, you only have two thumbs, but yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you, Christina. Yeah, I think someone had a question in the chat.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes along with this, so I figured we would say this one. So Clara Morgan, I think is the name, is, hi there, if you still take questions from here, I was wondering what Vaidehi thinks are the skills she uses most working as a dev. What is worth learning, investing in to become a senior dev? Now, I know this can be like really dependent, but what are your thoughts, Vaidehi?
That is a really good question. I think I wouldn't say anything specific to like any language or framework. I think the skills to get to that senior role isn't like, oh, get really good at React or like really learn a lot about databases. Like forget all that. I don't think that's actually that important. I think that if you want to get to the more senior position, being able to first like get really good at asking the right questions is probably going to help you get there. And so like we sort of talked about like pausing and figuring out whether something is actually solving the problem, what is the problem, whether there are other instances of that, like asking many questions before even starting off on doing something will help you get a better sense of the bigger picture of not just like the team and the product, but also like how different parts of the technical stack and different systems work together. And then I think the other thing that like is really important for anybody who's trying to get from intermediate to more senior is like just having the grit to know that you will eventually solve the problem. I think a lot of people earlier in their career are like, I don't know what to do. And that's okay because you just don't know all the things yet and you're learning it. And the important thing is as you grow in your career, you are still not going to know everything. But people who are more experienced are like, they have this like self-assuredness that, okay, I'm not going to solve it today. It might take me 2 weeks to solve this, but eventually we'll get there. Well, maybe we'll have to find a resource. Maybe I'll have to open an issue in this framework and ask them for help. Maybe we, take the easy route, but we come back and fix this. Or, like it might not be a seamless, easy answer, but they do have this like grit that they will eventually figure it out with enough Googling and enough research and reading and trying things out. And that is basically what our jobs really are. It's like we get paid to solve problems and figure things out and build things. And if you really want to get to the point where you're experienced, you just have to do that enough times and also believe that you will be able to do it again. And that's really the only thing I've noticed that senior engineers have, because a lot of the problems we work on, like Forem is a great example. We're trying to do something that is like very new to all of us. And there are other services that have worked on, working at scale, but every product and every team is going to sort of have to approach it differently. So nobody's there to tell you the answer. There's no Stack Overflow post to tell us like, how do you build a forum? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
We have to figure it out together. And so it's just like having that all to know like, okay, we will get there eventually, and like we'll keep chipping away at it and working at it. And like that, there is something encapsulated in that like just general attitude that I think makes people, a bit more experienced, and what other engineers on the team can sort of lean on to help them get their job done too.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, definitely what you touched on there. I pasted a tweet from Angie Jones in the chat before you actually started talking about it, but it's related to learning. And one of the things her tweet said, it's a short tweet, so I'll just read it out, but she says, "You're never going to know everything there is to know in tech. Instead, aim for the confidence to know what you can figure out." So
yeah, that's the one I meant to reference earlier. So yes, thank you for posting it.
And the other one that kind of popped in my head when you were talking about Googling is, yes, folks, Googling is a superpower. You get better at it. And it made me think of Scott Hanselman's talk from Codeland, which I loved. And at one point he's talking about Googling, and he's saying like, because he's been in software forever, and I've never met him, but he seems like a super awesome person. But he was just saying like, I'm just better at Googling than you now because I've learned to ask better questions. Like, so I feel like we're all just detectives, honestly,
Well, that's what I was going to add on to, kind of that, like, getting to senior level is communication, right? So you have communication as like knowing how to ask questions, knowing what questions you need to ask your team, knowing how to go back and forth and talk to, product or whatever you're doing. You need good communication skills. And if you don't have good communication skills, it's going to be harder and harder to work with a team. Like, you can be that superhero if you want of just like a developer by yourself, but working with a team and growing and getting to a senior position, you really got to have good communication skills.
Yeah, and it's interesting though. You mentioned that we are all detectives, Nick. That is spot on. In fact, I think when I was more in a mid-level role at my last job, I was chatting with my boss about like, how do you get to like, how do I make this jump from mid to senior? And like the one thing that kept coming up in conversation is just the word investigation. It's like you have to get really good at reframing everything as an investigation and like asking the questions and really getting to the bottom of it. And I think that's the difference between somebody who's like, oh, I solved the problem. It's like, you might not have actually solved the main issue. You just solved something that sort of masked the problem. And so when you're more experienced, you just get really good at digging in and actually investigating deeper symptoms. And like, that's when you start thinking about things differently, because you have seen enough of these issues that you don't need to necessarily investigate them thoroughly. You have enough past experience to draw from. But I think that concept of like, I'm a detective, I'm like investigating, that's really, really accurate.
I want some detective swag from Dev now, like a trench coat and like an Inspector Gadget or something. I don't know,
but we have a few questions about kind of like learning as far as you. So there's like a few of them that are similar. I'm going to start with one of them. This is from Tyler. What are some things you'd like to learn in the near future? Do you have anything you're excited about, you want to learn more about coming up?
I want to do more stuff with distributed systems. And I'm sort of like getting into that a bit more with our systems work. But we are also we haven't scaled to the point of like a big distributed system yet. But that's sort of what I'm interested in, is scalability. How do you build things that work across multiple nodes in a system? And like, what does it look like when things go wrong? How do you plan for things failing? Because inevitably everything's going to fail. I feel like that's what I need, that on a shirt, like everything's going to fail.
but it's going to be okay.
Yeah, exactly. We'll put that in parentheses at the bottom. Don't panic. But that's sort of like what I'm
Don't panic on a towel. I don't know if you all know. There you go.
We used to have, at my last job, there was a little piece of art that was hanging that just said, everything's going to be okay. And then I feel like that's what it's like. That's what you have to tell yourself when you're working with larger, complex systems. It's just like, it's going to be okay. Just got to get through this.
That's when everyone does like the hug ops on Twitter. Like, oh no, everything failed. Hug ops. I'm sorry. You'll get there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So along that same thing, unless you want to say something first, Nick, before I ask another question.
I was just gonna say, I think we have a slight lag, so we're playing like the unintentional interruption game. No, I was just gonna say, it made me, when you're talking about distributed systems, it made me think of, I can't remember the software that they use internally, but I think they open source it. But Netflix has like they purposely cause servers to go down so they can test the resilience of their software, and I thought that's like just a pretty cool idea, and maybe we can get to that point at some point with Forem, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I know what you're talking about too. I also can't think about the name. But yeah, I've seen that. I like read a blog post where Netflix was talking about like how they stress test their systems. And I think it's just fascinating. Like the amount of like big picture planning that needs to go into making like a robust, resilient system at that scale is just like,
yeah,
I don't know. I find it so fascinating. I think it's so cool.
Yeah, big time.
On that, besides distributed systems, Ben wants to know, Ben Halpern, are you curious about learning any new programming languages or tools?
I want to do more Rust work. I'd done a tiny bit of it. There's a tiny like core group of folks at Forem who are like, number one Rust fan, except we're all number one Rust fans, and there's like 4 of us. But I would love for us to write some of our systems architecture code in.
We might have lost Vaidehi for a second, but she'll be back.
Yeah. We're having some lag, but yes, now it is. Go ahead,
you're
Vaidehi.
back.
Now, you said that there was a core kind of like group of people who like Rust at Forem, and then I think you kind of cut out at that point. So
Yeah, so we're all big Rust fans. Then there's like a few of us that are like, secretly like number one Rust fan, except there's 4 of us, so we're all number one Rust fan. But I really want to do more work in Rust on a production level. So I've done I have a tiny little crate that I wrote once when I was trying to learn Rust, but I never actually got to really use it in anything. So I'd really like to work on our systems level stack from the Rust standpoint and help it tie it into our Rails architectural code, and sort of have those different parts of our system work together. And it would be really cool to have a super, super fast, infrastructure that doesn't have explosions in production and just you can compile it and know that it just works and it's not going to nothing bad's going to happen. So that's what I'm interested in learning next, or learning more of.
Andy asked about Rust, so that works. That was one of the questions.
Yeah, I didn't know there was Rust fans at the company. I haven't done a lot of Rust, but I did like the Game of Life tutorial, and I do want to learn it because and also you mentioned crates for folks at home. Crates are like Ruby gems or npm packages, just your code in a package. But yeah, it's something that I find interesting. I just haven't had time to dedicate to it, because I can definitely see stuff on the back end being beneficial with that, but also even on the front end with WebAssembly, WASM, if you've heard that term, folks, because I can immediately think of one thing, which is when we upload images to the server, we process the image resizing on the server, and if we just detect, okay, this browser supports WASM, do all the image processing, because ImageMagick, which is what we use, I believe, for that, I think it could get loaded up in Rust, because I'm not sure what it's written in, but you could do that manipulation on the client, so then you're like offloading server resources, and I don't know. I gotta get on the. Can there be a Rust fan number 5? Is that possible?
Yeah, Wasm is super, super interesting. I think there was a RustConf talk that I saw once where they basically were using Wasm to do this like really, really high fidelity like video game rendering completely in the browser. And I was just like, this is all in the browser. This is amazing. It was really, really cool. So I also think that like one of the things that like a piece of feedback that we always get at Forem, and back when we were dev, we used to get was just the fact that our site is super, super fast. And we always prioritize making sure that, Forem dev loads for everyone around the world. It's not like you need to have a browser that, has a certain kind of internet connection to use our software. We want to make it accessible to everybody. And so leaning into Wasm and Rust would be, us sort of doubling down on that commitment that we've already made, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
I know Rafi's in here, I think. Or go ahead, Nick. I know we keep cutting. Don't feel bad if you want to cut in. I know we're cutting out a little, so you're not bothering me if you want to say something.
No, I just said Team Rust. That's all.
Okay. All right. I know Rafi's in here, so I'm gonna ask his question because he did have a question. What do you think that Ruby on Rails community does really well that other communities can learn from?
I think they do a lot of things really well. They're super, super welcoming to people who don't have a traditional computer science background or who are new to programming entirely. I think they just have a lot of really great resources and like this infrastructure in place to help keep people who are interested, to help keep them in the community and help them want to stay interested. So this takes the form of like different conferences and like usually a very diverse set of speakers and like content that you can find. Like if you just spend time Googling for one specific Ruby or Rails concept, you will probably find multiple talks on it, blog posts. At this point, you'll probably find like a Rails cast, stream on it, open source implementations of these things. So there's just like so much different types of content made by different types of people. And that also takes the form of like their documentation, their Rails guides, all the just like all the content that's out there for different types of people in the community is pretty cool. You can find people on the Rails core team who will do a deep dive into something, but then you can also find something that's a bit more introductory. And so I really like that it really runs the gamut of like experience levels and resources that you can find. And it's also just super friendly and welcoming. And that's because of the leadership in the different open source core teams and the maintainers too.
Yeah.
Cool.
That goes on with Nick's question. Nick had a question on Dev 2. He said, and we'll start with the second one since this one's actually about Ruby. Okay, another question I had was, what is your favorite part of the Ruby language and or favorite thing about Ruby on Rails? And then do you have a least favorite part as well?
My favorite thing about the Ruby language is that it reads really beautifully. Like it just isn't like most other languages in terms of its readability. So like I will say that there's a caveat here, which is that if English is your first language, then I think it's a little bit biased towards you in that, it reads beautifully if you are a native English speaker. If you're not, it might be a little bit like it. I am a native English speaker, so I can't speak to that experience, but I feel like the barrier to entry is pretty low in terms of understanding what things are doing. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why a lot of boot camps, a lot of self-taught people will use Ruby, because you can read a method and someone who's never written a line of code could probably be like, okay, I think it must do something like this. And 9 times out of 10, they're probably right. So that's probably my favorite thing about Ruby, is just like its beauty and readability. It's really elegant. My favorite thing about using Ruby on Rails is just all of the all of the infrastructure that it provides, like it has this amazing, it has active record, which is an object relational mapper. I believe that's what ORF stands for. It's been a long time since I've had to define that. Like they provide you all these convenience methods, all this syntactic sugar, like you could do all these really fancy things. And if you don't really think about it, you just be like, oh, this is amazing. I can just call this method, or I can just ask this thing if this other method is defined. Like really simple, quote unquote, simple things, because someone has gone and made all of these like libraries and tools and gems, and there's just like a lot of different things you can use that have already been created. You don't have to build it from scratch. There's a lot of boilerplate that you don't have to think about. But that sort of ties into the thing that, that sort of ties into the thing that makes it hard, which is that there's a lot of stuff that's been abstracted away. So the moment you want to go off the happy path, or you want to do something a little bit weird or not conventional, or you run into something that is conventional but maybe is a bug, you find yourself in the source code, and then you could get a little bit lost, I think. And so that could be hard, but also I kind of find it fun because that has really pushed my understanding of things. Like I've done deep dives into like the Rails router because I was like, how does it work? Like, how does it just know where to send me? I don't understand. Yeah. I spent 4 years just using it and it's been great and I never had to think about it. But now I do want to think about it. And now I have to peek under the hood and I do not understand what's going on. And so like, it's a positive and it's a negative. Like depends on like how deep you want to go and at what point you hit the wall and you're like, oh wait, all these abstractions and nice little syntactic sugar things, now I actually need to know how they work and I never had to before. And so it's like a good thing and a bad thing.
Yeah I still don't have a lot of I've done backend before, but I don't have a lot of experience with Ruby, and I do need to dip into it sometimes in the code. And we did a pair programming session just before Hacktoberfest, and it's in regards to you can pin articles on your profile. And then once I dove into that, I learned about polymorphic associations and active record, and that was kind of throwing me for a loop initially because the ORM, the object relational mapper, hides all the database complexities, but I didn't realize you could have, because typically you have foreign keys, but this is like a dynamic foreign key, kind of like the way I understood it. And then you were talking about conventions, and so things are named accordingly. So like this variable is called this, and because the end of that variable name is this, if you use the end of that variable name somewhere else, that also helps create the association. And these are all conventions that like I just like from somebody new, I was like, okay, now I get it, but it wasn't obvious to me right away. So that's a bit of the magic you're talking about, I guess.
It's definitely, there's a lot of magic in a black box that you may not have to think about until you do. And then you're like, oh my God. The polymorphic thing, the first time I learned about them, I was like, I don't understand. And like, I had to just like literally draw it out. And sometimes even now I have to like sort of step back and be like, how do these work again? Like, how do I wrap my head around this concept? Just because there is a convention, but then, you have to understand the convention to actually properly use it. And sometimes they can be complicated. And the way that you might be structuring it might be a little bit weird. And then you have to figure out how does it work with the convention. So I totally feel that.
Okay. I'm glad I'm not alone.
No, not at all.
Nick did have one other question on there, which we can talk about before we there's a question that we'll get into that's a bit more about like the code base at Forem. But before we do that, let's go ahead and ask this question. How did you come to meet Saran and then start collaborating with him? So if
that's a good question.
Maybe you should say who they are first, and then.
Do you want me
to say, you can.
Yeah. So Saran is
Go ahead, Vaidehi.
Theron is, she founded Code Newbie, which is this amazing community for people who are new to coding or, starting off on their coding journey. And she's hosted like many different podcasts at this point. Probably the one that people knew her from first was the Code Newbie podcast. But she, at some point, we had met at a conference like in 2016 or something, because we actually both went to the same programming bootcamp at different times. I think she went like a year before I did. And she had seen my basecs content. And early on, I was just like, I'm going to write once a week and, explore a new computer science concept. And she, at first, I think the way that she has told me the stories that she saw, and she was like, cute, like not thinking that I would actually follow through.
Yeah.
And then like,
well, it is impressive.
She saw that just, yeah, I mean, a year is a long time, man. It's many days in a year. But at some point she saw the content like consistently being produced, and she was like, oh, this is actually interesting. And it's super like beginner friendly. And I have this community of people who are beginners and might not have access to this content. And Vaidehi has this content, but maybe doesn't, have my community, and she has her own community. So what if we could sort of tie them together and bring this content to everybody in a different format? And that was when she reached out to me about doing the basecs podcast. And basically all we did for that was we took every single blog post that I wrote and like talked through it and turned it into an episode, which was it was really fun, but it was kind of an interesting challenge, because technical concepts, especially computer science, when you aren't actually writing the code out and when you don't have like a visual representation, like you can't draw it out in a podcast, it becomes a little tricky to sort of talk through and describe it. So it was an interesting teaching challenge, and it was tricky for both of us in different ways of like, how do you create a podcast that has technical content that's approachable, and how do you explain these technical concepts using only your words?
Yeah.
So that was sort of like how we met, and she's rad. I have loved working with her, and hopefully get to do so more in the future.
Awesome.
Yeah, she released. I subscribed to it. I think I don't know if the company's called Disco or Disco HQ, or if that's just a Twitter handle, but it's like it's kind of like bite-sized learnings. She talks, once again, like both of your voices. I could just listen to whatever you say, but I'm doing the machine learning one with her right now, and it's really good. It ties into what you're saying about the teaching aspect of like, you don't have a whiteboard or anything to show the concept, so I think there's a lot of thought in how you explain the concepts, because it's just audio.
Yeah.
So, but I'm enjoying it. So.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to kind of shift things a little bit. We hit most of the questions on here, and we're going to shift a little bit to this next question that will probably take us into the Forem code a bit. So what's your favorite part in the Forem code base?
I have a couple, but there is one that has sort of become my baby in a way, which is some of our new code around caching. So to give a little bit of context, we had just this concept of Dev initially, which was this platform that was built over, years with different contributors. And it was definitely this like one entity. And then when we decided that, you can sort of actually create more communities that are like Dev, and that's sort of like the time that we transitioned from this concept of Dev as a company to Forem as a company and as a product, we started realizing that there were lots of things in our dev-centric view of the world that were very dev-specific and, kind of tied us very tightly to certain providers or architectural choices. And when you want to start allowing different types of people to use that software, you now have to sort of revisit decisions you made prior. And so one of the decisions that we had made back like way before I was at the company, was using a service called Fastly for caching, which is all great when you have like a high traffic platform, but not everybody wants to use Fastly. Not everybody wants to pay for Fastly. And more importantly, we don't want to tie our product to only one caching provider. So one of the projects that I worked on in a previous, like we call them cycles, they're sort of like sprints, but with a better name. But we worked on, sorry?
I was just gonna say best name. Never mind.
Yeah, I don't know. I think sprint is kind of triggering for some people, but I'm like, cycle's just like, oh, it's fine. It's just a cycle.
I'm gonna go to
but one of the projects we worked on was sort of making it not required for everybody to use Fastly. And so instead, what we did was create different options. You don't have to have caching enabled, or you can have Fastly, or you can use an open source provider called Nginx. And Nginx is basically the way that it works is you have a server that sits in front of the Rails app. And that server basically says, hey, if you send me a request, I'm going to give it to you if I already have it. And if I don't have it, I'll go over to, the Forem instance, your Forem instance. We'll just call it dev for now. And I'll go get that content. And then I'll keep it with me. I'll serve it to you, but I'll also keep it with me. And if someone else wants it, I'll give it to them. And that's actually really what caching is. But the main thing with Nginx is that you have this server in the front of your app that's basically handling all of the logic of caching. So we had all this code that was basically very Fastly specific. And then we had to say, okay, we don't want to make it Fastly specific anymore. We want to make it agnostic and allow someone to use either Fastly or Nginx. So that was basically what I worked on. And the code that I think Nick actually has it up. Let me pull it up. The code that Nick is showing you is only in the Forem code base. There were other changes that also had to be made in our configuration for Nginx, because as you can imagine, if you have a server sitting in front as a reverse server proxy, that server needs to know, like, okay, what does it mean for something to be cached versus something to not be cached, and like, how long do I cache it for? All of those things live inside of something called the Nginx config file. So we won't go through that, but if you do go into the cache buster RB.
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, so we have, perfect. So we have this self.bust up here on line 10.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So this file is basically like, it's somewhat big, and it has all these different methods that like are used to bust the cache of a comment, of an article, of anything that we basically cache. This is the logic to decide what to bust and when to bust it. But all of them call this method on line 11, edge cache bust.call. And that, oh, look, you can see my name. Edge cache bust is just this service that basically encapsulates all the logic to decide who is the caching provider and is it available and can we bust this cache. So you looking at this file don't really, like, you'll notice there's nothing about Fastly, there's nothing about Nginx in here, right? It's just, do I bust this comment? Do I bust this article? I don't care who is doing the busting, and I don't care who's handling the caching, just go and do the thing. So now if you open up edge cache bust, the service.
Yeah, basecs cache, but there's bust spec. Oh, edge cache, but yeah, okay, I got it.
Yeah. So this is the little service class that is super clever, and it decides, okay, who is the provider and are they like awake and running? So you basically create this class and it's initialized with this path. And then when the class is created, we have this determine provider method on that we call out to on line 9. And I think it should be defined further down in the file somewhere.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, so this method basically is like, okay, I just want to know, what are we using for caching? And so it basically checks, do you have Fastly enabled or do you have Nginx enabled? And right now we just default to using Fastly if you have that first. So really you should only have one caching provider set. And depending on what you have set, it will determine the provider. And then higher up in the file, back in the call method, it will basically do this kind of clever thing where it says, okay, I determined the provider. Now I'm going to call on a class that is named the same as the provider. And if that provider class exists, and if it has a call method defined on it, I'm going to say, okay, let me just ask that provider to do this work. Because I'm the cache buster class. Like I don't want to actually do anything except figure out who is the provider and then tell the provider, go do your thing. So Nick has this file already open. He has fastly.rb open to the right. So if Fastly is enabled, that cache buster service will just say, okay, I'm going to send this to Fastly, this Fastly class, and say, okay, you do the thing. And the thing is this call method again. And so we basically have like a lot of method delegation happening where we have this cache buster that calls to this edge cache bus service, which is smart enough to say, okay, who's the provider? Let me find the class for the provider, and I'm going to just tell that provider, go do your thing. And in this case, the thing is it making a post request to Fastly. And there's also an equivalent file for Nginx. I think it's called nginx.rb.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, so this is basically the equivalent for how to actually bust the cache on Nginx. So this file can check, is Nginx available? Is it running? I'm going to ping the service and see, is it running? If it is running, I'm going to figure out how to make a request to it. And then I'm going to make a request to it and handle any errors that might happen. And so we do kind of this nice thing where now, instead of being really tied to Fastly and like relying on Fastly always being set up, instead, if you want to add a new caching provider, you basically just create a new file, add a call method to it. And if there's a call method defined and you've added it to your cache busting service, it'll say, okay, great, I will just do whatever this class says, which is kind of nice because I'm sure at some point we might want to add another caching provider. Someone might ask for one, or maybe we want to spin our own one day. I don't know. We might pivot to becoming a CDN. Who knows? But this is the part of the code that like I'm really excited about, just because when you start to abstract things out, you start making the code a bit more flexible and less brittle, and things are less tied together. So this code looked very different like a couple months ago, and so this is probably my favorite part of the code base. Also, I didn't really know anything about how our caching was set up until I worked on this. So I learned a lot while working on this.
And that's a good reminder, folks. Learn how to learn. Yeah, no, and I guess that's great that it's been abstracted too, because in terms of testing, that facilitates testing because you don't have a concrete class that you're tied to. So I haven't seen the test, but I'm sure it definitely made that a lot easier too.
Yeah, it definitely did. And I think when you start splitting things up based on responsibility, where one class or one service is not responsible for a ton of things, now the tests also become easier, where you can mock out and stub out other services, and you're really only testing the functionality of that one service. Versus before, we were like mocking what Fastly was sending us, and we were like, this is sort of tested, but mostly we're assuming Fastly will do the right thing. And now with Nginx, you sort of like have to be a little bit more specific about how you test it, because Nginx behaves a little bit differently than how Fastly behaves.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's great stuff. Is there anything else you want to share in here, or do you want me to stop sharing?
I think that's the big thing. Okay. We can talk through like the backend Rails architecture if you want, or anything else if there are more.
You cut out for just one moment, Vaidehi,
That's
but
okay.
you'll probably
That's all
come in
good.
just a second.
I'm gonna freeze too. Yeah, she'll be back shortly. Yeah, so we were just wrapping up, going over the caching. I think Vaidehi's gonna talk a bit about Rails architecture potentially now.
There you are. You're
no
back,
worries.
Vaidehi.
We froze too. We just went like this.
Okay.
There was one more question before we get into that, if we want, just so we can hit all the questions that are in the AMA, and then we can talk about the Rails architecture a little bit. So Gracie just asked, so this is outside of this stuff. What are your hobbies outside of work that you do to help you unwind after a busy development cycle? The cycle word that we like here.
That's a great question. I've recently discovered that I love doing things not involving screens after work. It's really good for my mental health, and it's a nice way to just kind of disconnect, especially now that we all work remotely. We did before this pandemic, but now everybody is having a hard time disconnecting. So it's nice to have a physical division. So for me, I really like to go on a walk in the evening, take a bike ride. And I also really love to cook because it is creative and it uses a different part of my brain. And I mean, I like to eat. So it's just nice to do something very different, and it's creative and also is productive. So cooking is a really nice way of decompressing and doing things outside.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I definitely gotta get some recipes off you, because I love Indian. Because you cook a lot of Indian food, and I love Indian food. It's
I do cook a lot of Indian food. I cook a lot, and when I think a couple weeks or maybe months after joining Forem, I was noticing that there are certain other people on the team who also really like to cook and eat. So we now have this dedicated Slack channel called Yum, which is my favorite Slack channel, and it's just literally photos of people's food that they made and recipes and things that they're gonna bake on the weekend. And I'm just this is so wholesome and wonderful and what I need every day.
Why am I not in this channel? Now I need to go in this channel. I just realized I'm not in this channel.
Christina,
I love the channel.
This is the channel that you have been missing.
I have been missing a lot, and I do take pictures a lot of my food. This is good to know.
All right. Well, we know what we're doing after the podcast, after the streams.
Yeah. Okay, so and Nick, I don't know if you have any questions in particular, because I know you have been interested more in the Ruby and the stuff. If you have questions specifically about the code base for Vaidehi, but otherwise, I think we're just going to kind of dive in a little bit, a higher level overview of our backend on Forem. So
yeah, I think that'd be great.
Nick, if you want to ask anything.
I don't really have specifics, so it's more I understand high level Rails, and it's an MVC architecture, so model view controller. I think the things that trip me up still is the magic you were talking about. I'm not familiar with all the naming conventions still and stuff like that. So, and the other thing is I haven't had enough time to really grasp a lot of the things. So I know if I put time into it, I'll definitely grasp it. But yeah, there's nothing super specific. I guess maybe point out some noticeable things about the software if you think there's something you'd want to pull out.
Yeah, I think probably I'm just sort of looking through our code base. We have a lot of files and directories, but we do follow mostly Rails conventions. So I think a good way to think about approaching our code base is to pick a specific thing. So if you are looking at a feature or a feature that's been described, or a bug or an issue, or even if you're reviewing a pull request, if you're fairly new to the Rails architecture, then it helps to pick one starting point and then see how different things connect to that. So a great example of this is with MVC. MVC stands for Model View Controller. And there are other frameworks that also follow this. Ember is one. I think it actually took its inspiration from Rails. But the general idea is that a model encapsulates a concept or an object or some piece of information. A controller is responsible for going to the back end and getting that appropriate information and getting the model and doing, like, maybe doing something to it if it needs to, like sorting it or something like that. And then it's responsible for serving that to the front end, the browser side, and then the view is actually where it's rendered. So I think if you keep that general architecture in mind, it will be pretty, hopefully, easy to find a model and be like, okay, who is the controller that's serving this model? Okay, I found a view. How do I find the corresponding model? I know I have to go through the controller and then find the specific model that's being referenced. And if you sort of start to understand how this trifecta works, you can usually open a file and then very quickly, just through naming conventions, find the appropriate corresponding files. So if you open a model, you should be able to find, like if you open the user's model, the user model should be served by the user's controller, and then there should be a user's show or index page. And then you can also like look through the routes file to see all the different types of views and routes that are served, and those usually map to the controller and the views as well. So that's just like a very big picture overview of like Rails architecture. I think the thing that, is sort of interesting about the Forem code base is that we have a lot of different files in there that are specific to different dependencies. So we looked at the caching code, and that is sort of tied to now Fastly and Nginx. We have code that's specific to metrics and tracking. So we have like this gem called Ahoy that we use for that. So sometimes you'll find like an initializer that's like, what is this Ahoy thing? And a lot of the times, if you're seeing like a method or some sort of weird syntax and you're like, I don't know what that is, a lot of the times it's some gem that's like that can magically work because we've bundled that gem into our gem file, and it has like an expectation to write something a certain way, and it just magically works. A great example of this is also our authentication, what we use for authentication, which is devise. And so like if you look in our routes file, you'll see things like authenticated user, and it's like, what is that? That's not a Rails thing. Actually, no, it's not a Rails specific thing. It's this gem that you can sort of bundle, and it sort of sits on top of your Rails app and provides even more functionality. So the things to sort of look out for, I think, in Forem are little dependencies that are doing magical things that are not magic. They're just like abstracted away. But if you follow that general MVC architecture, like you will usually be able to find how one thing connects to its corresponding model, view, or controller.
Okay. Yeah, and like you said, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nick. No,
I was going to say, you said it follows pretty much the traditional Rails folder structure, because like I know there's like controllers, models, folders. So in terms of finding things, it's pretty easy to navigate to them.
Yeah, I think so. I think the other thing is like we have certain things that we've rolled on our own to solve certain problems. And if you look at our code base, you might be like, oh, I've never seen this before in other Rails projects. And those are more like Forem specific things. So one example of this is something called the data update scripts, which I believe our SRE team worked on. Okay. Shout out to Molly, who I think this was her baby, the data update scripts. I've worked on other projects where, you want to make a change to the database, or you want to like drop a column or rename it or change some data. And locally, it's super easy to just reset your database and just be like, okay, I'm going to just run this migration and add this column, whatever. The problem is, on production, you can't just be so laissez-faire about it, because now you have, discrepancies in one column having a certain value, or dropping this column and then needing to reference it later. And just generally, I think there is an anxiety around doing anything to the production database. So one of the things that Forem has now, because we've built it, is this concept of a data update script where you can go and update production data fairly safely. And you don't need to go into the console. You don't need to ask somebody to like, can you go, like, you don't have to ask them to go and like change all these things or like update this column to be this thing or remove all these and set it to nil. You don't have to do that. You can use these data update scripts. So there are certain like little things that are not specific Rails conventions, but we have made use of basic Ruby concepts to make things easier for the scale that we operate at.
Okay. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, because anytime you're dealing with data, you don't want to do an oopsie in production. So no, that's great.
Absolutely. The times that I've like brought down production have like 80% of the time it's been like a migration that went too long, or like I dropped something, or like I locked the database. I'm like, now nobody can write to it. Like I get a little bit of my blood pressure rises whenever I'm like, oh God, I have to make a change to production data. And like I think as I've gotten more experience, that's less so the case because I know what questions to ask. But also like now at Forem, we have certain things in place that let you safely write a data update script. Now people are reviewing that code rather than you just running it in production like the wild, wild west. And it's like, you have a little bit, you have more buffer room that hopefully you don't make a mistake and more people will catch it. And we're sort of collectively thinking about these things rather than you being like, I have to make this change. Hope I don't bring the site down.
I feel you. I remember one place I worked at, my first production deploy, I locked the database immediately when I was deploying. So it's like, it could do anything.
I feel like everyone has one of those stories, like it's inevitable. It's going to happen at some point. You're going to bring down the site. It's just a question of when.
Yeah. No, I was just glad the database administrator, who I knew pretty well, she was there. So she's like, yeah. She kind of did a tisk to me, but then she sorted it out. So it was all good. But
we do have a question in the chat, which either of you potentially could answer, I think. So how does Forem use asset pipeline and Webpacker for JavaScript?
Oh, Nick, you should answer this one.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So.
Yeah, so we use sprockets as far as I know in terms of Rails. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, Vaidehi, but I think sprockets is the default in Rails for a while now in terms of asset pipeline. So we have all these files. There's a folder. It's under app/javascripts, and these are what we call like the legacy scripts, JavaScript. It's not really legacy. It's just it's stuff that only gets built with the asset pipeline with sprockets. So if you you can go into production and you can actually, if you look at the code base, you look at some of the files that are in there. But if you go into production or your built local development, it generates a base.js file, which is this huge JS file that has all of those files in there. I think it's really just concatenated. I think that's what Sprocket does. So it's just one after the other, and then it might minify it a bit. That I'm not positive about. So there's that aspect. And then the other part is we use Webpacker. So for those who aren't aware, Webpacker is a gem that allows you to it facilitates using Webpack in a Ruby on Rails application. And I think Rhymes, one of my other coworkers, told me it's the default for the asset pipeline in Rails 6, I believe. I'm not positive about that. But what we do is, for those that have worked with Webpack, you have this notion of entry points. So an entry point, think of it as like if you've ever done like Create React app or any kind of Vue app or whatever that bundles with Webpack, you'll have typically an index.js file that gets generated, and that's like your starting point for your app. And then from there, Webpack will have, depending how it's configured, it'll split code and stuff appropriately. It knows how to do these things. And so it kind of just kind of spirals out that way. And not spirals, but kind of like frost, like as I need things, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there, grab that bundle. So all those things in Webpacker land in the Forem Codebase are all the pre-act components that we have. Any ES modules, which is ECMAScript modules, which is the newer module format that is supported in pretty much most browsers now, except for IE. It's supported even in the older Edge, I think, but that's how it's broken down. I can definitely go into that in more depth if folks want, but that's essentially it. I would recommend the Webpacker documentation is good for showing you how to bridge that gap with Webpack, but if you really want to learn more about it, I would suggest reading the Webpack documents. It can be a big read potentially, but I think it's good to know your tools, so take a peek at those. I'll pop in the link to the Webpack docs there. Does that answer the question, or is there some stuff that's unclear maybe?
We can give people time to put a question if they have it. I think we have hit all the other questions. I'm reviewing real quick to make sure we actually hit all of them. Did I ask you this one yet, Vaidehi? How do you take time to learn new technology in your busy schedule? I'm not sure if I got to that one yet. Like how you like to learn things. We talked about that some. Do you have like a way that you fit that into your busy schedule?
I really appreciate that this question acknowledges that I have a busy schedule. I have a hard time acknowledging that to myself sometimes. Like, I can do this, I have time. And then I'm like, no, I don't have time. That's a very good question. I think I have to set time aside at like a chunk of time that's uninterrupted to learn anything new. A big part of that is just like really, I really hold my time as sacred. So like I will say no to things now, and like I've tried to like really minimize meetings on my schedule just because I know myself and I like need 2 to 3 hour chunks, ideally like two of them a day at least, where I'm uninterrupted to be able to dig into problems. And in the past in my career, I used to like have to find time in my personal life to learn things that I just wasn't able to really, encounter at my job. But now kind of like in the nice position where I took a role at a company that was sort of doing the thing that I wanted to learn. So if possible, like try to make that learning time part of your job. Developers are really, really lucky that we have this amazing job that we just learn all the time, which I think some people hate and some people love, and it is good and bad because there's always something to learn. But you can usually get paid to learn something if you find the right place. And it's pretty cool because getting to grow becomes part of your job description. So I think just probably hold your time as sacred, that creative like learning time when you get to, fuse those neural network things in your brain and make those new connections. If you don't have time to really dig into something, you won't be able to do that because context switching is really hard. Digging into something and then getting interrupted is just like really frustrating. So like find those hours, find those uninterrupted blocks of time. And like, if you can tell your manager, like, I really want to do this. I want to learn Rust. I want to get really good at JavaScript, or I don't feel like I'm really good at like Rails. I want to do more Railsy things. Like usually communicating what you want to learn can also be beneficial to you finding a way to work it into your work hours. Yeah. I would say that if you can do it in work hours, do that. Avoid doing what I did, which is like sacrificing a large part of your personal life to do side projects. And if you're going to do that, like be balanced about it. I think I'm much more balanced about it now than I was. But at the same time, if you really want to learn something, set boundaries and just do it, because that's what I did with basecs. And I learned a lot of computer science stuff. I would not have learned that stuff on the job. There's just like there's no, you don't really do computer science fundamentals in web development from what I've seen. So
sure. Yeah, even a lot of math stuff. Like I did go to university and I did a few levels of calculus. I have literally never used calculus in any programming I've done since the beginning. I think the most math I've done is working in e-commerce for calculating totals in a shopping cart. That's that's about as mathy as it got for me so far, I think, So it's.
I know someone who does a lot of really cool CSS stuff with calculus and like math. Maybe I'll link you to him sometime, Nick, and you can check her out, and maybe you can use your calculus.
All right.
That sounds really cool.
Derivatives in CSS, bring it on. All right.
I think the most math I've had to do for actual like web development. One time I had to like render a pop-up, like a tooltip. And then like I was working with another developer and we were trying to figure out how do you render the tooltip so it doesn't go off the page. So we had to calculate the size of the rectangle, calculate the size of the window, and then like offset it. And it was really like, it was just math. Like it wasn't calculus, it was just basic math. And I was like, oh my God, this was so hard.
Yeah, no,
it's more logic. True, yeah. Our work is more logic based.
Yeah, in terms of calculating stuff in CSS, yeah, no, it's true. You use it there too, but I just feel like math just hasn't been a big part of my programming journey. I'm not complaining, but it's just kind of funny. You need to learn all this. And it's like,
I'm finding her. Okay, Anna Tudor. If you've never seen her stuff, she has a lot of
CSS I know her name.
math.
She's got some next level CSS stuff from what I've seen.
Yeah. Yeah, she's also got a lot of great like articles that are like oftentimes above my like I'm just like, wait, I can't understand this, but they're actually really good. And if you like take the time to like try to break them down a little and see like her kind of like her examples and stuff on CodePen and things, then yeah, you can start getting them. But yeah, she's next level in her CSS.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm always impressed. Like CSS, people really love to hate on it for whatever reason, but it is hard. It is hard. And like one time, I think I was working on, this was for my like Rust project, and I had to like learn the algorithms to convert RGB to HSL. That's the other math thing I had to do. Don't ask me what the algorithm is. I had to eventually Google it and be like, okay, just tell me the answer. I don't know how to convert it. But like there's like some interesting things with like color theory, animations, rendering things on a page. It does require a lot of like calculation. It's pretty cool.
I was gonna say I do animations, and so I have seen a lot of the math. Like when I realized like how much math are in some of the things of the animations I wanted to do, I was like, oh man, I need a refresher, because some of this stuff I can't even necessarily figure out until I figure out the math first. I mean, a lot of the animations I don't have to, but some of the stuff, especially if you get into like Canvas and different things, you use a lot of math for them.
Yeah, Canvas is a little wild. I haven't done anything with it, but where I used to work at, it was Autodesk, so it worked in like a movie software, and one of my coworkers had created this Easter egg game in the software. So like it was this little jumping guy, and it would find like I think divs, or no, it was a Gantt chart, and the Gantt chart was generated with Canvas. So he created a game on top of it, so the character could jump on the bars in the Gantt chart. But the thing with Canvas is it's not like DOM elements where you can say go get me that element now. It's once the pixels are created, they're there and that's it.
Yeah.
So anyways, as a side note, I was just impressed that he did that. So
yeah, I had to create a game and they wanted to use Canvas and I had to learn it. That was one of the opportunities of like learning on the job, because they kept changing like what they wanted me to do with animations. But that was like the weirdest thing for me. It was like, wait, I can't actually grab anything and like the DOM, there's nothing here. Like I have to just tell it to make something, and it just like threw me for a while. Like, how do I do this? So yeah, it's a lot of.
I think I've had very few experiences working with D3, like a few of them, and I feel the same way. I'm like, D3 is not anything. It's like just a whole other.
Yep.
I cannot rely on my previous knowledge. It just wants me to do it a different way.
Yeah, I think it's
definitely
Shirley Wu who's like really good at D3.
She's really good. Yeah, she's got a couple of front-end master's courses that are really good. Yeah.
Yeah. Anytime I see all that stuff, I'm just like.
Yeah.
It's like.
Yeah.
No, it's just really impressive. That's all. I know we're going on tangents here, but it's.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have about hit the time that we usually kind of wrap things up, and I think we did get to hit all of the questions. So just wanted to say again, there is an AMA that was on Dev I just linked to, so that's where we were getting the questions from, besides the ones that were in the chat a little bit. And we just want to thank Vaidehi again for joining us, because this is really fun and we learned a lot. So
Yeah.
I don't know if either of you want to close with anything.
I'll let Vaidehi finish, but I just want to say, like, I had an awesome time. It's great talking. I know we work together, but we haven't been working really that much together in the past few months, so it's just kind of cool catching up and stuff. So
I know. I was gonna say thank you so much for having me on, and also like I can't believe I didn't realize we hit time. I was just having such a fun time just vibing with you all, and just like nerding out.
Yeah,
those are always the most fun conversations, I think. So thanks for taking the time and chatting with me.
Cool.
Yeah, and it looks like Shirley Wu is going to be on a Twitch today streaming. So if you all want to learn D3, they linked that in the chat.
Cool.
So
all right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll be back tomorrow. We're pairing with Maria Antons, who's a dev community member. We're going to be working on a issue with the podcast liquid tag. I think there's some issues with the validation, so we're going to be looking at that. I don't know anything about that code, so I have a bit of homework to do after this stream. So send help maybe. I don't know. Cool. All right. Thanks everybody.
thank you.